Welcome, and I know we're going to have a fantastic interactive session this evening. I'm very keen, as quickly as possible, and I know Helen is as well, to open up a conversation with all of you, and hopefully with all of Dubai who are passing by and can join in as we go. I think you all know Helen's work. She's been an inspirational Prime Minister, an incredible UN leader, and a public figure of huge authority and impact over, how many years do we say, Helen? A few years. And today what I want to do is to really dig into that experience and try to understand from that what can we learn as individuals about leadership and about making change happen in the world. And we're enormously privileged to have you, Helen, here, and thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us this evening. I wanted to start. We're in this place of incredible opportunity and optimism. You can feel it when you walk into this building. There's an energy to it. Are you, with all the experience you've had on the front line of politics and looking at the world today, are you still optimistic?
I should ask first, are there any New Zealanders in the shopping mall? Maybe, okay.
Hey.
They're everywhere, you know. Am I an optimist? Yes, I am. When I was at the UN, the Deputy Secretary General was a very senior Swedish diplomat called Jan Eliasson. And when he was asked that question, he used to say, yes, I'm an optimist, but I'm a worried optimist. I never qualify it like that because while the headlines we see on our smartphone screens every day are usually pretty shocking and worrying, nonetheless, I think if you go sort of underneath that noise, you do find incredible people doing incredible things that actually are changing the world for the better. And you take your faith and your optimism from all that energy that's happening in communities around the world.
And how do you do that when you're leading an organization like UN Development Programme, when you're at very senior levels of the UN? How do you ensure that you balance that time with the people who actually need the support against all of the bureaucratic churn and process that comes with the job?
Well, I think with development, where you draw your inspiration is from meeting and interacting with the people who are actually making change happen. And often these days the role for a development agency will be connecting people with ideas, making sure that good ideas don't just stay in one place, but they can be talked about, they can be shared, best practice can be communicated. So that to me is probably the essence of 21st century development. Look at who else is doing it. There's no problem really that's unique. So that follows from that endeavouring to address it, you will find others working in the same space, and people can leverage the way they innovate from what they see.
And probably here, you might have future UN leaders. You'll certainly have future or existing entrepreneurs and innovators and problem solvers. If you were to give this group a to-do list of problems that arguably our generation of diplomats has failed on, what would be at the top of your list?
Well, it's kind of like saying what's the top list of global problems? I mean, clearly inequality is a huge issue, and you look at these protests that are happening around the world at the moment. What has driven people in Chile, 1 million people to come out on the streets, the government to cancel international summits, but people saying, it ain't fair here. You know, we're sick of being told we're the best performing economy in Latin America. We don't feel it. And the protests there started off a metro fare rise of 4 cents. Now, we might think, what's 4 cents? But if you're poor in Chile, another 4 cents every time you get on the metro, it hurts. So this issue of inequality, my country might be going ahead, but what about me? My life isn't any better. So why is this so? another major reason around a lot of the protests is corruption. Citizens revolting against what they see as corrupt behaviour by their leaders. And then there's the phenomenon of lack of voice anyway, that people feel, we haven't been able to say what we want to say, so they're reacting against those systems. Some of these protests are a combination of all the above: poverty, corruption, inequality, lack of voice. And then there's also the protests we've seen where people believe an election has been stolen. And there's nothing more depressing really than participating in an election which you think might bring about change, and then it doesn't, because the result has changed somewhere before it's announced. So I think we've got all of that swirling around in a lot of countries now. Then if you go to the sort of environmental side, I mean, climate change, climate action, this is one of the existential challenges of our time. And think of a setting like here in UAE, where everything's built along the coastline, right? What happens when the sea level rise comes? It's a little vulnerable, but that's just one of the many problems. So I think there's plenty of challenges to get our teeth into and look at what societies are managing to navigate around these and what we can learn from them.
So no pressure, but you've got a long list there of problems to fix. Good luck. We'll be cheering you on. You mentioned, Helen, the protests, which are springing up again, as they seemed to be doing 4 or 5 years ago and then receded.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, including in this region, would say, well, social media is actually making the situation worse. It's increasing a perception of inequality, and it's increasing distrust in governments and leaders, and making it harder then to actually govern in the interests of the people. And yet you were one of the early pioneers, really, of using Twitter and social media. Is social media out of control now? Should we put it back in the box?
Well, you can't put it back in a box. And I'm of the view that the balance is very much on the positive side, in the sense that it connects people and ideas. News spreads fast. It can be an agent of change. I think can certainly be a democratizing force in countries where people are really yearning for that and wanting to connect with others. But there is also a negative side to social media, and one of the things I'm talking about here in this visit to UAE is what to do about the negative side. And my foundation, established in New Zealand at the start of this year, one of its first projects came after the massacre at the mosques in Christchurch, where people will remember, because there was so much publicity about these shocking, horrible events, that the killer was able to tweet his intention. Nobody took any notice. He live streamed the murders for 29 minutes. Facebook took no action, and then uploaded the video to YouTube, where it's been seen more than 1.5 million times. Now, this is wrong. In every sense, it's wrong. But I think that Facebook and these others were set to connect people and ideas, but they've also connected very bad people and very bad ideas and actions. And we have had a regulatory gap where we can't deal with that. So that's one of the areas that the Foundation's been generating some ideas about, and going to Paris Peace Forum next week with proposals as to how to take that discussion further, because you don't want to, in my opinion, clamp down on freedom of expression and exchange of ideas and building communities. But there is a limit. And absolutely the limit comes before you reach the point that killer was using social media for.
So would part of the answer for you be to be tougher with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram? Would you introduce more regulation, more control of the platforms themselves?
So what we suggested, and this comes out of the New Zealand context, but I think good ideas can come out of small countries that others then see a way of adapting and innovating from. We think there should be a duty of care, a statutory duty of care placed on these platforms. They should have a code of conduct. they should have remedies and redress mechanisms, and they should be held accountable for those. So you do a mixture of self-regulation and oversight. Now that kind of builds from two experiences in New Zealand with the way in which we treat speech issues in the broadcast and print area. In the broadcast area, we have statutory regulation, a Broadcasting Standards Authority. You cannot in New Zealand broadcast things that are transparently untrue or evil, as in the sense of these kinds of events I'm referring to. And you do have a remedy for redress if that happens. The regulator can step in. In the print industry, the newspaper industry, you have self-regulation, and actually quite responsibly done by a media council, which the media companies sit on. But here we have these social media platforms which are global, but operating in all our countries, and we need to find, a sort of, I suppose the term is a bespoke way of regulating. And so that's why we came up with the idea of, yes, they should have strong codes of conduct and acceptable behaviours, but there needs to be some oversight in the public interest to see that they are held to the standards they set themselves.
But somehow, with all of these challenges that you've mentioned, including climate change, including the regulation of big tech, people don't tend to talk much about the UN. And I know obviously you were a leading candidate to run the UN, having run one of the biggest agencies, and probably, I think we can say, you can't say this, but I can say that if there'd been a public vote, you were considerably ahead as the main candidate, if that had been the process for that job. And yet, a lot of people would look at all these challenges and say, well, actually, the UN is not part of the solution anymore. So do we just simply need to start again, reinvent or disrupt the UN, or does it still have a value going forward?
Well, it definitely has a value, and if you didn't have it, you would have to invent it. But it is a little tired at the moment, I think. And one of the things that tires it is that we live in a world of more multipolarity, which doesn't lead to more multilateralism. So you have many different competing forces that don't necessarily see cooperation in the UN as being the stage that they want to play on. So UN, of course, remains extremely important to small countries. My country is a small country. UAE is actually a small country because that's where you get a voice and you can have a say. But I think we should see, and let's leave aside the peace and security side for a moment, where I think the main value of the UN lies elsewhere is in the capacity to negotiate conventions and agreements, to be a platform for bringing countries together to talk about those things, to facilitate moving forward. It did that with the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, and Sustainable Development Goals, Law of the Sea, you name it. There's a lot of achievements out there. So it's very important in creating global agendas, global rules of the game. Then you need the goodwill of countries to pick up those rules and agendas and run with them. And that's where, it can be a little depressing to see, for example, in our news today, that the US administration has just given formal notice of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. This is not positive. However, I remain optimistic that the way the pendulum swings in a democracy like the US, they'll be back. But the missing in action isn't so helpful at the moment. So the UN is there. It's a bit tired, but it's still there to be used by everyone of goodwill who sees that our world faces challenges which can't be solved by any one country alone. We have to work together to solve them. That's the reason it was founded, and it's a reason that remains for its existence in the 21st century.
And yet when you look at the guardians, really, of the UN, if you think of the permanent members of the Security Council, at least 3 of those members, the US, Russia, and China, are fairly actively disrupting the international system, the international rules-based system that we built with such patience and sacrifice in the middle of the last century. The other 2 permanent members are Britain and France, and without dwelling on Brexit, the Brits are quite distracted at the moment.
Somewhat.
Does that give an opportunity then to these smaller countries to be much more influential in the international architecture?
Well, a Security Council is a problem. It's a major problem because having given those 5 countries a right of veto in 1945, it's proved impossible to take it off them and to kind of broaden the power sharing of the Security Council. And you end up trying to work around it, in a sense, rather than work with it. When I was New Zealand Prime Minister, Kofi Annan had a big conversation going around 2005 on how to reform the Security Council, and it went nowhere, and maybe it'll always go nowhere, which is not satisfactory because we do have very real peace and security challenges out there, and a polarised Security Council that can't do anything about it. But yes, to come to the point of your question, I think there is a role for the groupings of the like-minded countries to be coming together to offer up solutions. And I mean, where do we see breakthroughs in peace and security issues? If you think of countries that have been in deep trouble and a way through has been found, the 2 examples foremost in my mind are where regional actors actually came together to support a country out of trouble. I think of the Gambia, which facilitated the exit of a long-running dictator, not to put too fine a point on it, and helped the democratic election result actually get bedded in. I think of the recent developments in Sudan, where I think the African Union mediator did an absolutely superb job. Mm-hmm. I mean, that could have gone disastrously wrong. But and it may well still do so. But you know, there is a way forward if regional forces can keep the pressure on the 2 sides to the agreement to move forward in a way that meets the aspirations of the Sudanese people. So, you know, those kind of examples give me hope that even if the Security Council isn't so helpful in finding answers, that perhaps with regional communities coming together to support countries in trouble, you can get somewhere.
When you look around the world today at your fellow leaders, and you can see some like Angela Merkel, who've been in those positions for a long time, very patiently delivering. You have a very inspiring, innovative successor as Prime Minister of New Zealand, but then you also have a group of leaders who are very different to that, who are almost going back to an old-fashioned, more macho, authoritarian style of governing. Now, when you ask people in the world, why don't more women come through to these positions of influence and authority, often the first example they cite is your example, that you'd run New Zealand very effectively, you'd run the UNDP very effectively, then you hit the glass ceiling when you went for UNSG. What are the obstacles that are preventing women reaching those senior positions?
Well, I think the main obstacle is that there isn't yet the critical mass of women leaders that provides the examples for people to see that women do these jobs as well or better than men do them.
Is that the case?
Yes, yep. It certainly is. And, you know, I mean, I come from a country with now its 3rd woman Prime Minister. So, you know, New Zealanders know women can do these jobs and can do them well. But, you know, most countries haven't had that experience. So I think in the last Secretary General election at the UN, the majority of the candidates were women. But none of the women got into the very top polling group of candidates, which tells you that there was a barrier there, that somehow countries weren't comfortable with the women candidates. Maybe the women are seen as less controllable, less clubbable. You know, heavens might have a mind of their own, might be leaders, you know, things that aren't necessarily being looked for in the job, and yet are desperately needed at the institution. But I'm very confident that a woman will become the Secretary General of the United Nations. It may be next time. The next time, the position will almost certainly go to someone from the Latin American and Caribbean region. There are so many incredible women in that region who could, you know, credibly come forward and lift to that position. So it will happen. It's just a question of time.
So I want to open up now to questions. So you're now formally on notice that I'm in the market for questions. I think there are microphones around that should be floating. So could someone grab a microphone? And just while you're doing that then, one final one from me, which is just to ask, so I've observed fairly close up a lot of former leaders. I've watched people make that transition from having huge entourages and walking around and all the bodyguards and all the glamour and attention that comes with those positions. And then suddenly they're having to get the tube in the morning and finish their own emails and so on. And lots of them really, really struggle. And I'm sure you've observed that too. But you haven't. You've managed to make that transition and retain a sense of real humanity. What's your secret? How have you managed to keep your feet on the ground?
Well, firstly, I think it helps to come from a small country and one that's very egalitarian and actually doesn't put leaders on a pedestal. It likes the leaders who succeed are the ones who people feel are like them. You know, it could be their daughter, it could be their son. So there's an expectation that you are part of and relate to a community. You're not positioned sort of up here with everybody else down there. And so I was always very conscious as I made my way on the political ladder in New Zealand that there would be a time when I wasn't sitting there anymore. And I would come out of that position and I would have to, reinvent myself some other way. So I always, I think, kept very much a sense of reality, that this was a privilege to be in the job for a period of time, but that privilege wouldn't go forever, and frankly shouldn't go forever, because you need turnover and leadership. You need fresh ideas and people. So it was a transition that, in the end I was happy to make. I reinvented myself at the UN. Actually, the best reinvention has been since leaving there, because I am now unconstrained by any institution. I spent my life, I suppose, in institutions, as most of us do. I was a university lecturer. I was a politician for 27 and a half years, sat at the top of a UN agency for 8 years. And hey, now I can go and get the tube. I can go and see rock churches in Ethiopia. I can do whatever I like, choose what's important to me. And that's what I spend my time doing. I find it quite liberating.
Yeah.
Quite refreshing.
And is it really true that you spend the last day or two before every long journey putting food in the freezer? Is that right?
Yes, I have a father who's 97 and a half and lives independently, but I do all the meals. So before I go away on a long trip, I get very busy cooking and make sure that he has enough meals in the freezer. Before I go away. That's the way we support each other as families. And I like doing that. I feel, we all owe a lot to our parents. Our parents invest a lot of time and care and love in us and help us meet our aspirations. And there comes a time in your life when the tables turn and they need you to be supporting them. So that's the time of life I'm in.
So there you go. For one of the startups here, if you want a business idea, you've got Helen Clark's frozen meals to go, delivered to your door. Right, let's, sir. Here we are.
Firstly, Ms. Clark, it's a real privilege to hear you speak. I'm delighted that you're here.
Thank you.
I guess since its inception, no issue has dominated the United Nations as much as the Palestine-Israel conflict. And no issue at the same time has delegitimated the United Nations as much as that particular conflict, as a result largely of US constantly vetoing every resolution that has ever been passed which promotes justice and peace for the Palestinian people. Having said that, given the almost totally hegemonic role of the US in mediating that conflict, do you see any future alternative to the US playing a significant role that is independent and that is fair and even-handed, which promotes justice?
I guess, as you've said, the particular interest of one great power in that protracted, unresolved conflict has kept the United Nations at bay from it. The UN, over the decades has done some good work in mediation, but it hasn't really been able to get near that one. Probably the most solid mediation effort was the one the Norwegians facilitated, which resulted in the Oslo Accords. And of course, there's now a lot of debate about whether that was a step forward or a step backwards. I'm inclined to see the glass more than half full myself, but even that has proved very, very hard to progress. But I must say, looking completely from outside and coming from a region of the world that's a very long way away from Palestine and Israel, what I know is that the vision of a settlement which has the two communities living side by side in peace, in the end, is the only sustainable solution. There's nothing else that's sustainable and can endure. And it really beats me why that is not more blindingly obvious to some of the key players. And the longer that kind of vision and solution is postponed, the harder it becomes in a way to get there. So that's distressing. But yeah, the UN has been pretty much kept at bay from attempts to resolve it.
So I think, we have in the front row.
Thank you. I don't know if it. Yes. Hi. Thank you very much for being here and for your voice. You've said something that I found very interesting, that leaders in New Zealand are not put on a pedestal, and I find that's quite admirable and goes against everything that we're used to in the Arab world. I was wondering if you could think of any way that we could possibly reverse that, because we're far gone. We have all our leaders elsewhere, all over the Arab world, on pedestals. And I wonder, would it be changing that? Would it be through education, through the media? I mean, how do we reverse that, I wonder? To bring them down from the pedestal and to teach the young generation that this is not a permanent position and it's not the all end.
Well, I suppose to some extent that has been achieved in Tunisia, which of all the countries that had the uprisings was the one that came out with a democratic constitution, power changes hands, people have voice, constitution is a very good, actually state-of-the-art constitution in so many ways. So to me, that's quite admirable that there's been such a change around. But clearly that path hasn't been so easy to take in a number of other countries. And the so-called Arab Spring, which quickly became a winter for so many, has of course seen a war that's now in its 9th year in Syria, Libya in chaos, Egypt, a lot of repression of voice of youth and others who dissent. I mean, I think the constitutional monarchy options of Jordan and Morocco are quite interesting, where you've made there's been a transition from sort of absolute ruler to parliamentary governments. But the region will have to find its path, and I suspect there'll be a lot of agony yet before we see more outcomes like the ones I've just mentioned. But I think there is a yearning in the region for people to be able to have a greater say and for leaders to be more accountable and to deal with that sense of privilege and corruption, which can be very corrosive over the long term.
Thank you for being here today. I feel very privileged to be able to listen to you. I'm Ahmed Nabil. I'm a physician and researcher from Imperial College London and one of MIT's winner this year. The reason I mention that is because as a young entrepreneur and innovator, I honestly feel like there is a gap in dialogue between our generation, and don't get me wrong, you're still very young and beautiful, but the older generations who are more experienced and have the wisdom that we need, and they are the decision makers. But I feel like there is a gap between us. And I'm part of the One Young World organization. We had Kofi Annan attend all the summits that we do annually. We had Mary Robinson, but we do that once every year. I feel like we need to do more frequent conversations and bridge the gap. So how can we do that?
That's a good question.
Well, I guess it's a question of creating spaces and forums for that, isn't it? And exposing audiences to a wide range of perspectives of people who have had experience which may be of interest, may not be directly applicable to a particular region, but at least it brings new ideas, ways of thinking about things. I rather like the efforts some of the international media channels like BBC go to Doha debates, I think we see, where you really get a debate about the future of a region and different perspectives. So I would put the emphasis on creating those spaces, and more than once a year, and using the social media platforms to make those conversations available for people who can't physically be at them but can be looking. I mean, this I understand is going to go on YouTube, so watch the space.
Yeah. And just to develop that point, is there more that the public at large can do to hold leaders to account, to use some of that social media power that they have as individuals to influence politics? When you've been sat on the other side, what was most effective in influencing you in terms of public campaigning and public pressure?
Yeah, it's interesting because social media is so new. I mean, to anyone perhaps under 25, you might think, what's she talking about? But I left being New Zealand Prime Minister 11 years ago. Twitter had only just started. I didn't have a Twitter account. Facebook was very new. There was no Snapchat, Instagram, WhatsApp, any of this stuff. So it's very, very new. So I operated as a politician in an environment where it was more traditional. There was TV and there were newspapers and there was radio, but there wasn't what you see now, which creates communities quite quickly online and a much quicker mobilisation around issues. What did I kind of see, hear, sense, pick up as a politician who was quite connected? Mainly what you would be hearing from the non-governmental organisations, professional associations, lobby groups, interest groups, and you'd have to make your own judgment about who you listen to and what you took on board. That comes with experience too. But I think now, looking at the way that social media can influence debate, you can be much more quickly on to what are the moods and currents here, what is trending, as a topic, what are people coalescing around. You get a much quicker sense of what the public pulse is.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Do you have a mic at the back there? Perfect.
Thank you. First of all, I'm in absolute awe. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'm not sure if I can articulate well, but I'll do my best. I like to operate from the world of systems and intersecting systems, such as governments, UN agencies, philanthropy. I mean, you have them represented behind you. Academia, I think, has an important place as well. And in your experience, what participatory government mechanisms have been adopted to successfully shrink the gap? In other words, promote equity and equitable opportunities. What has promoted inclusion in a way that reduces those gaps that we've been discussing, whether it's geopolitics or socioeconomic gaps, for us to really look at what they say in the SDGs, leaving no one behind. So in your experience, what are some of those mechanisms that can either be leveraged from policy, or whereas from social movements, youth movements, to help create a voice, a more unified voice, and advancing the SDGs forward, or this global agenda forward? Thank you.
Well, I think using the SDGs as framing has a lot of possibilities, because it does direct you to systems thinking. How does that affect that, and should get decision makers out of silos, but should also get organizations out of silos. I'll give you an example. I was invited to a big event on SDGs at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden earlier this year. And the leadership of Karolinska decided that they wanted their world-leading medical school to pick up the SDGs and see what they could do, how it related to their mission. And so we had this day-long conference, and a lot of students attended, and there were breakout groups. And one of the main bits of feedback from the students was, we want to be able to talk to people, to students and peers who are not just doing the field of study we're in. If we're going to be doctors, we need to know what's happening in the environment. We need to know what's happening in social policy. We want an education that connects us in to everything that's going on around us, because otherwise we can't be effective in what we do if we don't understand the context. So I think the SDG framing gets us thinking about what does this mean for education? What does it mean for government decision making? What does it mean for the sounding boards, if you like, or the engagement forums that governments at whatever level have to bring the citizens in? In some ways, I see in my country, and I think there'd be a number of countries, at least among OECD countries, that operate like this, local government is probably better set up to work in this way than central government, because it still tends to have planning power. Most Western countries, they long since abandoned national planning, and they have to retrofit themselves for the SDG era, which does require them to be taking this overview across economy, society, environment. So, yeah, I think if we use that framing, it is a challenge then to create the forums and spaces where you get the interaction between citizens and society. And by citizens and society, I include, the academia, the private sector, the non-governmental groups, and so on.
Should handle crisis or the women empowerment that we see. So we have countries at the table that are setting the example and walking the walk rather than just talking the talk.
Yeah, and I think the small countries that are walking the talk need to be, building alliances and coalitions among them around issues to try and, push the international debate in a positive direction, because we don't get that leadership, obviously, out of the Security Council in its current state, and the Security Council is very, very difficult to change because of the built-in veto that comes from 1945. So I don't think other countries should despair. I just think we need to, form better coalitions around issues to push things forward. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of a major UN conference that's coming up in Nairobi next week, which I'll be going to, and it's the Cairo Plus 25 conference, the big conference on population and development, which set out the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda, which is so critical to women and to youth. That was Cairo in 1994, and there's a 25 years on conference. Now, just to mention the topic of it is to say, hang on, what's going to be the attitude of the American administration? What's X and Y going to think? But there are countries that are really joining together to make this a positive conference about the right of women to access these services and determine their own future. So we need more positive coalitions coming together around issues like this.
But would you be, just to pick up on the question, would you be tougher with, say, a US president who was well outside UN values? Do you think the UN should really stand up to that sort of leader, or try more diplomatically to absorb the pressure?
Well, it's a question of what countries do and then what the UN organization does. I mean, as I see it, the UN is tiptoeing around it. At some point, I think you need to draw a bottom line. And that bottom line was drawn by Kofi Annan on the Iraq invasion. which was, one of the major mistakes of our century, to have a unilateral invasion. And Kofi Annan pronounced it to be against international law. He undoubtedly had the majority of member states with him. He paid a very heavy price for that, with the pressure that he came under then from some great powers. But he did the right thing, and emerged from that with a lot of respect as a statesman. So at some point a bottom line has to be drawn, I think. Diplomacy in the end is about being diplomatic, but that doesn't mean that an opinion can't be stated about what the UN as an organisation or its leader thinks is important. The withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is frankly ridiculous. The only saving grace is that in a big and complicated political system like the US one, yes, the federal government is missing in action on climate change and all sorts of things, but there are big and powerful states which are getting on with it and making a difference. If you're the governor of California and try to deny climate change when the fires are raging through your state, even close to winter, you would be regarded as a complete fool. So there is action at the state level, and significant action. And at some point, the pendulum will swing at the federal level, and we'll get an administration again that will want to be proactive on these issues. But for now, probably we shouldn't be too polite about how ridiculous it is to opt out of the Paris Agreement.
I find personally, as a diplomat, it's quite refreshing to hear you use a word like ridiculous, because I think one of the things that creates such barriers between the UN and governments and the public at large is that we create this language around diplomacy where we'd say, well, of course, it's a matter of growing concern that America has opted out of the Paris, which no one uses words like that in real life. No. And I think the more that we can actually speak human, the more influence and engagement we'll have from the public that we actually serve. So I hope that more leaders start using words like ridiculous.
Well, I
Not
do,
about us, but...
I do remember at the time of the very heated debate about the issue of Iraq in 2003, and there were efforts, particularly by the United Kingdom, to get Security Council backing for an intervention in Iraq. So at least the UK tried to use the system. Didn't work, but it tried. But when there's an open debate at the Security Council on a big issue like that, all member states are entitled to go and make a statement. And because I, as Prime Minister of New Zealand, and our Cabinet were very interested in this, of course, I said the statement had to be run past me. And I got this mealy-mouthed statement, and I said, that won't do, so I wrote it myself. And probably it was sheer agony for the New Zealand permanent representative to deliver this statement because it was more direct than they were used to delivering or people were used to hearing, but it said what we thought. Yeah. And one of the key points it made was that if it's a very slippery slope to ignore international law and proceed without support of the Security Council, because if you do it once, how are you going to condemn those who do it for another purpose that you disapprove of some other time? But anyway.
Madam.
Thank you so much. Helen, pleasure meeting you, and Tom, a few times we met. So, going back to gender balance and the work that I've read that you do with the women empowerment space, how do you think the ideas of innovation and entrepreneurship help us to bridge that gap, to enable more women to get into that pipeline, to get into that channel that can push them, we can pull them up and see more representation on higher levels and higher cadres?
Are you thinking in the sort of innovation space of technology and so on? Because one of the things often women do is don't follow the subjects in their schooling and education which would lead them to that track. And you know, it's pretty obvious that in the technology sphere you've got a huge gender gap, right? With the guys have been pushed to do the STEM subjects and the girls have, you know, gone away from it. And of course there's many exceptions to that, but there is a huge gender imbalance. So I think, you know, it is really important for families and educators to be encouraging girls who are good at these things to follow it through and not opt out. And, you know, I think a very positive thing we can say about girls and women is we tend to be perhaps more human-centered. We want to do things that are meaningful for people, and sometimes we don't relate that as much to the technology sphere. But I think humanizing technology is also a very worthy endeavor, and I would like to see the gender gap in STEM and technology changed.
From an educational perspective, that is spot on. But for example, if we bring in innovators and entrepreneurs, and these days the ideas of using technology as a platform to bridge the gap between employers and talent, I think that is something that we need to explore more. And I'm really curious how, you know, governmental agencies and global entities like United Nations can support innovators and entrepreneurs to do that.
One of the things I saw happening, you know, increasingly towards the end of my time at UNDP was a lot of interest in supporting accelerator labs and innovation hubs and hackathons or whatever to sort of, you know, try new ideas and development with younger people, because I think often, you know, development had quite an old-fashioned approach where it was seen that, you know, you started with agriculture and you went to industry and then to services. That's not the world today, right? The world today is that, as New Zealand shows, agriculture is not a sunset industry. It's very, very, very vital. But secondly, with robotics and digitization and AI, the traditional path of agriculture to industry to services isn't going to be followed either, because, you know, the whole potential for mass employment and manufacturing is gone. So countries need to move very quickly to services. And then, you know, if you're going to be really successful in services, you have to be in the innovation space, the technology space. So, you know, it's not a question of sort of painfully working your way up a ladder as a least developed country. You need to be providing the environments in which the young and savvy and switched on can, you know, leapfrog all those different rungs of what used to be a traditional ladder. And it was very exciting for me, you know, probably 7-8 years ago, to go to iHub in Nairobi, which was an innovation incubator, which was as good as anything I'd seen in my own country or anywhere else. Yeah. And young people, to get into that tech incubator, first had to, you know, show that they had an idea that was worthy of getting a place there. Your first place, if you got on the first rung of the ladder in the tech innovator, was you got a high stool and a bench. And then as your idea developed, you actually might have got to a desk, and eventually you got a breakout room. But, you know, it was exciting, and there were very interesting ideas and innovations coming out of it. Similar thing in Kigali. But, you know, we're only restricted by our imagination, and often these things have been seen as Western and developed, or for, you know, go-ahead countries like this one. But no, in the poorest countries of the world, there are young people with ideas wanting access to opportunity, angel finance, whatever, to get going, and we have to create an environment for that to happen.
Yeah. It's quite striking in a way that often when you're in government, you're looking for innovators to support government policy, and so you invite innovators and entrepreneurs into meetings inside government and ask them for help. Yeah. Actually, we've reversed that today. We're coming out into an incubation space, an innovation space, and saying there are a bunch of government challenges that we cannot solve as leaders and diplomats, and we need the help of young entrepreneurs and innovators to help us crack those problems. Absolutely. So it shows how far that debate has moved. Sir.
Your Excellency, question about AI. Where do you stand, you know, with your experience and leadership and being a politician? where do you stand on AI, and do you think humanity is doing the right move in that direction, the artificial intelligence?
Well, you know, I mean, genie's out of the bottle, right? It's happening, it's developing. The thing is to get it developed overwhelmingly for positive purposes, not negative. And when one sees highly authoritarian countries seeking to be leaders in artificial intelligence, that creates some cause for concern, because it can mean ever more sophisticated control of people rather than opening up, you know, opportunities for human beings. But I'm not a pessimist about the so-called fourth industrial revolution and AI and digitization, because as I see it, with every sort of iteration of industrial revolution, people have said, oh, what's going to happen? Where are the jobs going to be? When the spinning wheel was, you know, replaced by a factory machine, when basic clerical jobs were replaced by the computer, we all said, where are the jobs coming from? But we, as human beings, are so ingenious, we keep inventing jobs that, you know, no one would have imagined even 5, 10 years before. So to me, the most important thing for governments to do is to have sort of forward-looking strategies as to how you can keep your country moving ahead with all these changes. And there is absolutely no substitute for investing as much as you can in education, trying to keep young people in education all the way through, in that education encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation, and obviously a high degree of digital and other literacy, investing as much as you can in your connectivity and infrastructure, and you know, creating an environment in which people can be very flexible, adaptable, acquire new skills, have the finance to try new things. Because if we stand still, we're going to be run over in this fast-moving global economy. And I guess, you know, one of the things that always excites one about countries like UAE and like Singapore is that they have been capable of running with these new futures, right? Just enabling it to happen and making huge change possible within relatively short periods of time, which often make the rest of us look a bit flat-footed. Yeah.
So I'm very conscious of your time, Helen, but also the time of everyone here. So I think we've got time for 2 to 3 quite quick-fire questions. I've got one here, and then one here, and then one here. Let's take them one at a time, actually. So 1, 2, 3.
Hi. So just coming off of the AI question, would you agree that current regulatory structures are a bit dated and not quite flexible in that adapting to societal and technological challenges? And if so, how do you go about in creating a regulatory structure that is more adaptable and flexible and acts as an enabler?
That I don't necessarily have an answer to, because regulatory structures often tend to be retrofitting, don't they? And we see a challenge and we see the gap, and then we scramble to find solutions. Again, I think if governments are, you know, sort of onto the need for foresight, anticipating the challenges that will come up, starting to, you know, think how we'll react to that, have an interface with the community that's operating in the sphere. Because in the end, it's in the interest of innovators in these spaces to have a clear set of rules in the operating environment as well. So it probably requires us being a lot more interactive between government and sectors in society to work out rules of the game.
And I think one challenge is that often people in government don't understand technology that well themselves. And so they're actually quite scared when you start a conversation about AI, for example. They feel quite insecure.
Yeah.
And so just helping to educate government leaders will help them to be better able to engage in that conversation.
Yeah.
I think, Madam.
Hi, my name's Sarah. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation.
Thank you.
I have a question on being human, on being a woman, following her passion in her career and achieving successes in her career. How have you maintained a balance between your private life, your personal life, and work to not feel isolated in moments of successes? Or do you feel a certain level of sacrifice is the essential ingredient for achieving that kind of success?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken on that subject a lot to groups of women who are, striving in careers and finding they're having to balance a lot of things. And the advice I always give is, first thing is you have to look after yourself and your health and your relationships. Because if your career becomes so all-consuming that you're doing 18, 19 hours a day and you've got no time for your family or your friends, when you come to the end of the run of that career, you're going to think, I'll what's the family doing? Where are the friends? And they've gone because you've neglected them, right? So you have to think about that. You have to build that into your time, that this is important to stay connected. You have to look after your health, and your exercise, your food, all these things. But also, I think one of the tricks with leadership is to be able to get the people around you that you can delegate to, because you shouldn't have to do everything yourself. I was visiting one of many countries earlier this year where a number of new women ministers had been appointed, and they said to me, we just find we're completely weighed down with these jobs. We're working 20 hours a day. We can't keep it up. It's not sustainable. And I said, well, it's not sustainable. So I said, tell me what you used to do. Now, each of these women were experts in a field. And I said, the first thing you have to overcome is feeling that you need to know as much about every part of your ministerial job as you knew about that area of expertise, because you can't know that. You are now a leader. You have to lift yourself above that, and you have to have around you the good advisory system where you can get the advice you need so that you can be credible as a leader. But you can't know everything yourself. That's the first tip of leadership, really. And you could sort of see a sign of relief come to them, because they were trying to know as much about everything as they'd known in their very specialized areas. So I think, there are tricks of the trade like that.
Great question. I think just in the front row, just here. Madam.
Good evening, Your Excellency. And just to go back to social media, I think one thing I find interesting is how it's democratized influence. And at the same time, I want to know what you think about the idea, and I'm trying to articulate this properly, is because social media has democratized influence, it's also left people very vulnerable to many sources of information. And I want to know your opinion about that, where there's so many different trusted sources, and at the same time, we're living in an age of distrust, especially like generation like mine. You're 25 and up, and UN is not the only solution anymore. There are different entities to look to. Just what is your opinion on that? That there's just so many sources of information, but how do you become a person of good character, but at the same time not be vulnerable to live streaming horrible events like that happened in Christchurch?
It's kind of like we need, a component in our education system around social media literacy, because, clearly there is, the fake news phenomenon. There's the manipulation. I must say I'm one who's quite pleased that Twitter has decided it won't take any political advertising. Now, they then have to define what that means. But, again, if I think of my own political system, you can't run a political ad that tells a lie about someone in a newspaper or on radio or television. You can't do that. It'll be stopped. But anything goes on social media. And Facebook has said they're not going to do any quality control. You can put whatever you like up, which is why Elizabeth Warren, the presidential candidate, then put up an ad that deliberately told a lie about Zuckerberg to prove the point that this was nuts. So they've taken a sort of extreme libertarian position that you can say anything you like about anybody. And of course, As you say, there'll be people who believe that because they don't know any better. Whereas Twitter said, no, we don't want to be in that space, which I admire, and they won't take the revenue from it. But for me, if I was, kind of endeavouring to teach people about social media literacy, I would be saying, look to trusted sources of information, right? If you haven't seen it on a reputable news site, then, and if you can't cross-check it on a reputable news site, it actually probably isn't worth your attention. So, yeah, look, what is Reuters reporting? What is BBC reporting? You have very credible news sources which take pride in getting it right and will correct if they get it wrong. So, be alert to what is reputable and what isn't. And when you follow people, look, what is their reputation? The reality is, and I can be completely undiplomatic now, you wouldn't believe anything much that President Trump said in a tweet, right? You wouldn't. It's not credible. But there are very credible opinion leaders that you can follow because they've built a reputation of getting it right and having an opinion that you might not agree with, but it'll be based on a judgment, and you know where they're coming from.
And if you were still running New Zealand now, which would be the social media platform that you would be using? Because you were an innovator on Twitter, so I guess you'd want to try and stay ahead of the curve now. What's your tip to the aspiring leaders in the room?
Of course, social media is quite segmented, and I took to Snapchat, which is wonderful for the sort of under 20s, and it's a fun app. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got LinkedIn, where the LinkedIn constituency don't like anything frivolous. They see themselves as a serious professional constituency. So you're not going to put your Snapchat snap on LinkedIn. That'll just annoy people. That's for a different audience. And then, my preferred medium is Twitter, because I think that you can have a succinct message or comment with a link that people can explore, if they want more detail. I think Facebook has it's a little bit old-fashioned now, in a way, but a lot of people use it, so you have to be active on it. And Instagram, I think, is great because it's around the photo telling a story and then what you build around that. And that's proved to be very, very popular now with young people particularly.
So Helen, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thank you to all you guys for absolutely fantastic questions. I know that we could go all night, and I'm pretty certain, I haven't checked this, so it's a bit of a gamble, but I'm pretty certain that Helen will be happy to answer questions on Twitter if you bombard her. Don't bombard her, but if you have short questions that you feel have been unanswered, that you didn't get a chance to raise, please do send them to either of us, and we'll get you answers to those. It's been a real masterclass in not just what's happening to international organizations, but also in how to lead in the 21st century, and also, I think, how to be a human in the 21st century. So thank you very much to all of you for coming, but most of all, thank you, Helen Clark, very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.